continuation of Grandpa
Right,
talking to little
right.
Mulgie. And when he asks the question, is everything black bad?
Mm.
And so Grandpa continues these lessons of we all have a heritage.
Hmm.
We all have a heritage.
And that book really reminds me of when I was a child and the many stories and rich history that my grandmother and on my mom's side and my grandfather on my father's side shared with us. So it was sitting around the kitchen table, nibbling on snacks, but listening and learning and really being taught to be proud of who you are. So that whole piece reminds me of the way that I now interact with my own grandchildren. And so the book that I selected to read, I Love My Family. And although this is a book that really talks about all of your family members and the importance of family, I want to highlight just a few of the pages that talk about the grandparents. I Love My Family by Wade Hudson. Every summer, Daddy, Mama, Mommy, my sister Andrea, and I go to Grandpa Lawrence's farm in North Carolina. And I'm sure a lot of people can relate to those summer vacations where we took the drive down south to visit with grandparents. That's the time for our family reunion. All of my father's relatives are there. And it goes on to talk about how they meet up with their cousins from Philadelphia and their Aunt Belle and their cousin who says that he was a globetrotter, but of course they don't believe him. And they talk about how a little baby was the youngest member of the family to be at the reunion, and of course their great aunt, Nell, who was the oldest member of the family to come to the reunion. A family reunion is a special time. It's a lot of fun, too. We go swimming, we play ball, we pick peaches, we sing, and we dance. At night, we listen to scary stories that Grandpa Lawrence tells. We eat lots and lots of good food. Every year we put up a big poster of our family tree. It shows how all of us are related. My name is on there too. And I can remember one of our family reunions having a similar tree, family tree that a cousin had constructed. It took hours and hours of time to put that together. On the last day of the reunion, a photographer takes pictures. Grandpa Lawrence and Grandma Bert are there. And just a lovely illustration of the grandparents. We have a family picture taken every year, and every year our family gets larger. And so here's an entire family. Of course, with Grandpa
and always
Lawrence.
There's always going to be a new baby.
Yes,
always
yes.
A new baby.
And Grandma Bert holding the new baby. So just a lovely little book to illustrate how special family members are.
You know, we probably should say it a little more frequently, but so many of all the books that we've been featuring are by African American authors and illustrators, and I love seeing those stories like the family reunion and the heritage kind of thing, because so often children are not seeing the range and diversity within black families.
Right.
And it's all children can come to understand that we do have this diverse richness that with family reunions, with heritage stories, with grandparents telling us stories, sitting around, grandparents sharing the raising responsibility. There's a lot of richness and diversity in the African American community.
Right.
And it's important that children, all children, get to see this. There's the typical roster of books that they were all reading, but it's so wonderful and significant that we have this body of literature that children can see brown and black faces in the literature books.
Right,
it's
right.
so important that we bring that to them.
Absolutely. And I think we may have mentioned before that we did a column in a national parent magazine for well over 10 years.
It's almost 14 years, yeah.
And we highlighted African American literature written and or illustrated by African Americans. And one of our columns talked about how we want to honor grandparents in children's literature. And sometimes I know we featured literature for boys and literature for girls. And periodically, we really do want to highlight the body of books or literature that really feature African American grandparents. So today, that's what our topic is. We are really focusing on how grandparents really rock and how we can honor them by sharing some of this wonderful literature with young people of all ages. This is On the Go Radio, powering the voice of community and change. And our show, Once Upon a Time, with Dr. Jody and my special guest, Dr. Tony. So we have a few other books that we'd like to share with you. What other titles do you have, Dr. Tony?
Let's take a look at, I'm going to get a little bit out of order here, but I'll do Grandpa's Face, which is an Eloise Greenfield authored this book. And Eloise Greenfield is a legend in children's literature. She probably influenced people like Jacqueline Woodson. We've certainly shared a lot of Jacqueline Woodson's books with you. And Floyd Cooper, who does just fantastic illustrations. And he does them all with chalk, pastels. That's how he does them. But this one is about Grandpa's face, because Grandpa has a very pleasant face most of the time. And the little girl, Grandpa lives with the family. The little girl, Tamika, loved Grandpa. She loved the quiet way he talked and the surprise of his loud laughter. She loved the stories he told, long stories that he sang, and talked a little bit each day until he reached the end, just like you were saying, listening to those stories. Grandpa's face told everything about him. It was always changing from glad to worried to sad. Grandpa could ask questions without saying one word. And even when he was mad with Tamika, his face was a good face. And so the look of his mouth and eyes told her that he loved her. "You shouldn't have done that, Tamika," Grandpa would say, and Tamika would tell him that she was sorry, and then she would kiss the sturdy brown face. Well, the story goes on with Grandpa and Tamika going for walks and having a good time in their neighborhood. And Grandpa belonged to a community theater group. So sometimes Tamika would go with Grandpa as he went to do plays or see plays. And the theater was one of Tamika's favorite places to go. Make-believe things happened there. She would sit in the front row and watch Grandpa turn into another person, changing his face and the way he walked and talked and sang. And even when he turned into somebody else's grandpa, Tamika didn't mind. It looked true and it felt true, but she knew it was just play. And when it was all over, the actors came out and bow and bow and bow and wave. I love her. She says, and bow and bow and bow and wave. She could clap so hard that her hands hurt. Well, one day Tamika's watching Grandpa practice his lines, and he's playing a very, very evil part. And he scared Tamika. He scared Tamika, and she thought that he was angry, and she didn't like watching him that way, so she gets very sad, and she doesn't want to see him like that. And at dinner time, she's not a good little girl. She spills her pee, she spills the water, and she looked at Grandpa's face, and it was still the face she knew, but she just became mischievous at the dinner table. Finally, a parent said, what do you think a parent said?
Oh, leave the table.
Leave the table.
If
And she
you're
had
not
to leave the
going
table.
to.
She spilled things, and so finally she let out that, Tamika, what in the world, Grandpa said. Tamika turned and looked at him, then expecting to see the face that she had seen in the mirror. But it was Grandpa's face she saw. Grandpa's mad face, but still was the one that loved her. Mama and Daddy worried. Tamika, Mama said, what's this all about? Tamika hung her head and didn't answer. Stop crying, Daddy said. He wiped her face while Grandpa went to change his shirt. So finally, Grandpa goes out and talks to her, and they're sitting on the front porch or the front stoop if you're on the East Coast. Then Grandpa came back and took her by the hand, and she said, let's go for a walk. So they go for a walk, and she's still a little sad. And then they sit down in the grass, and Tamika lets out the words spill out. The words come out of her mouth. The mouth is mean, and the eyes were mean, and I don't like that face, Grandpa. But that was just pretending, Tamika, Grandpa said. You know that, but it might not always be pretend, Tamika said. Well, finally she realizes that Grandpa is learning his roles for the next play that he's going to be in. He really isn't mad with her. But it's a powerful, powerful little book because it's through the expressions on Grandpa's face.
Right.
This wonderful book by Eloise Greenfield, and it's been around for a long time. You could really call it a classic that should be in every home. And illustrations by Floyd Cooper. But the face, you read the face, and the face tells her so much. So that's another really good grandpa and granddaughter interaction. What do you got?
I have two, in fact, two chapter books by Jacqueline Woodson, and there are a couple more in this series about a character named Maison. And Maison is in middle school, and this first one I read myself was called Maison at Blue Hill. And it's when Maison is very bright, and her grandmother, who is raising her, of course, would like to see Maison in a school setting where she could really work to her potential.
Oh, okay.
And so in the first chapter, you get a feel for how Grandma is working to support Maison's education. Would you look at this? Grandma said. We were sitting on the couch in the living room. Mr. Parsons from the Blue Hill School sat across from us smiling. And Blue Hill is a private school.
Okay.
That's the hill the school was named for, he said, pointing toward the picture Grandma was looking at. I frowned at him and rolled my eyes. Did he think Grandma and me were bozos or something? The hill was blue, well, sort of. It looked like it was covered with moss and grass at the same time. Flowers planted to spell out Blue Hill School grew around the edge of it. Isn't this beautiful, Maison? Grandma pushed the photograph toward me. There was a stack of them on her lap, and we had been looking at them all morning. Mr. Parsons was full of pictures and pamphlets and information about Blue Hill. All I wanted was to stay right on Madison Street with my best friend Margaret, to go to PS 102 instead of some school in Connecticut. So Blue Hill School is not only a private school, but a boarding school in Connecticut. So Maison is not really happy about the prospects of leaving her community and her friend. I had plans for the fall. I was going to find out where our neighbor, Mrs. Dale's special powers came from, and if there was a tiny, tiny chance that she might be planning on passing them on to me. "You're going to love it, Maison," Grandma said. Mr. Parsons smiled and nodded. "You don't even know me, man," I wanted to say to him. "How would you know what I'm going to like?" "It looks nice, Grandma," I said instead, because I knew all summer long Grandma had been bragging to people about me going away to Blue Hill. "Are there other black girls there, Mr. Parsons?" Mr. Parsons blinked. "Yes, Maison, of course there are other black girls." "Then how come there aren't any in any of these pictures? We must have looked at 100 of them. And how come there aren't any in this?" I waved the catalog at him. "The catalog needs to be updated, Maison," he said slowly. "We're working on doing that this year. Blue Hill is actually somewhat behind other schools in a way." Mr. Parsons cleared his throat before continuing. "While we have small classes with caring teachers and some of the best athletic equipment, we're still working on being more inclusive, bringing in more minorities and students who financially wouldn't be able to have a boarding school experience if it weren't for scholarship." So Grandma and Mr. Parsons have big plans for Maison to go to the boarding school in Connecticut. So this is a great read. And if you have older upper elementary students, they would really love this one. Maison at Blue Hill by Jacqueline Woodson. Again, we mentioned Jacqueline Woodson earlier, and we not only do we have chapter books by her, but we also have some picture books as well. So if you're looking for a wonderful story to expose your young people to, dealing with a youngster leaving their home environment to move out of state to a boarding school, you'll enjoy. It's quite an adventure.
That's a formidable challenge. So 9 to 12, we've not been giving the age groups, but it's about 9 to 12.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good series. That's a really good series.
And the second book in the series, or one of the other ones that I have, is Between Madison and Palmetto, also by Jackie Woodson. And I think there are a couple. Another one is Last Summer with Maison. And so those are 3. It's a series of 3.
And that's good, because our kids read lots of other series, whether it's the 8-year-olds reading something like Captain Underpants, but there are great series that feature African American children, and really, really, really good. What else do we have? We've got some more. We've got 2 Mrs. Gibsons. Do I have 2 Mrs. This is another one that I really like. 2 Mrs. Gibson by Toyomi Ignis. And the the illustrations are by Dara Wells. So, again, this is a grandparent book. We see grandparents intervening, getting kids into, quote, a better school, and grandpa's interactions. So with 2 Mrs. Gibsons, this little girl is telling the story of her grandmas. And she says, "I knew 2 Mrs. Gibsons." Well, it's a story of her mother and her grandmother. And she says, "I knew 2 Mrs. Gibsons. This Mrs. Gibson was tall. Her skin was the color of chocolate. She was born in America in a place called Tennessee." And so there's one Mrs. Gibson. And the other Mrs. Gibson, this Mrs. Gibson, was small. Her skin was the color of vanilla. She was born in a place called Japan, called Kifu.
Okay.
Mrs. Gibson gave hugs that were like being wrapped up in a great big bearskin rug. "Come, give me some sugar," she would say. This Mrs. Gibson gave hugs that were like wrapped up in a light down-filled comforter. and at bedtime she'd stroke my hair and hum Sukara until I fell asleep. This Mrs. Gibson was loud. She had a big laugh and a big voice, which would get louder when she was angry and when she was singing. And she seemed to be singing all the time. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This Mrs. Gibson was quiet. She would cover her mouth when she laughed so you could see her teeth. You would never see her teeth. And when she was angry, she'd get even quieter. This Mrs. Gibson had small hands that could make the littlest, prettiest strokes of a pen, and she'd write our names in Japanese. Kimiki, Akimi, Yomi, and Yoshiteru. This Mrs. Gibson had big hands, and they looked like they covered all the keys on the piano when she played the spirituals. This little light of mine, and she's going to let it shine, and she would play at the piano. So, with this little girl, she goes on telling how one Mrs. Gibson would wrap her up in a kimono, and the other one, she'd wear her church hat.
Okay.
And her Sunday go-to-meeting hat. And how one grandma, she'd play in the backyard catching fireflies. And with the other one, she'd make the little paper, I'm forgetting the name of that. The little paper. Origami, right. Yeah. So she'd make little birds. And how one Mrs. Gibson would cook a pot of rice, and we would sit with bits of meat and vegetables in it. And the other Mrs. Gibson had a pot of greens, turnip greens, cooking and dandelion greens and mustard greens from the garden. And everything seemed to cook for a long, long time. One Mrs. Gibson had short curly hair and would oil and braid her hair every night as she listened to the radio. She liked to braid my hair too, but she would always give me one big fat braid that hung down over my forehead. Didn't like that braid, so I'd go to the other Mrs. Gibson and she'd take it out. So as the story goes on, making the comparisons, she says this Mrs. Gibson's other name was Kazumi. Everyone called her Kaz or Connie because they couldn't pronounce Kazumi. I called her Mommy because she was my mother. And the other Mrs. Gibson's name was Viola, and everyone called her Vi or Reverend Gibson because she was a church minister. I called her Nanny because she was my grandmother. I once knew two Mrs. Gibsons. They were very different, but they had a lot in common. They both loved my daddy, and they both loved me.
What a cool story.
Yeah, so the little girl, Mommy is Japanese, and Daddy is African American.
Okay.
And she gets to know the two Mrs. Gibson
in
her
Mrs.
life.
Gibson.
And I believe Toyomi Ignis her father was African American, and her mother was Japanese.
Okay.
So all kinds of diversity within our home.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we have really shared a variety of grandparent books. Everything from grandmother raising a young person to two grandmothers or mom and a grandmother from two different cultures, and of course Grandpa's face, which highlighted a grandfather who was acting, but the young person really didn't realize it and was frightened. So good variety of books about grandparents. And so again on Sunday, September 10th, in whatever way you see fit, please honor grandparents on that special day. This has been Once Upon a Time with Dr. Jody and my special guest, Dr. Tony Walters. This is On the Go Radio, powering the voice of community and change. Take care until next time.